So here Sri Krishna, after first talking about himself as the incarnation, as the divine being itself, then he speaks about the state of the realized soul. Because, as I said last time, the incarnation in the Hindu tradition doesn't exist as a separate category distinct from human beings and eternally distinct in nature. But the incarnation is a human being, but also one who knows from before his birth his own identity with the divine. That is, it's the divine being itself which takes on human form and comes down to show us what our nature is. And you find that idea in places in early Christianity. In fact, it was it St. Athanasius or St. Clement of Alexandria, I forget which, one of the early fathers of Christianity, Eastern fathers of Christianity, said that God became man so that man might become God. And so that there the idea was actually that man is not God, but Christ became man so that man could become God, could become divinized. But the Hindu idea is that we already are divine, but we've forgotten it. We are one with the infinite reality, but we've forgotten it. And so God comes in human form in order to remind us that that is what we are. And so Sri Krishna, in the Gita, it's a natural transition from talking about his own divine status to talking about the nature of the realized soul, one who has realized their divine nature. And then here he begins to talk about work, how it is that a realized soul, though acting, is unaffected by the action. And then he goes from that, the nature of the action of a liberated soul, to the nature of sacrifice. Because it's through sacrifice that we perform spiritual practice. We are divine now, according to Vedanta. Our nature is pure, perfect, eternal. We've only forgotten it. And we act on that forgetfulness, and that's where all of our trouble comes from. But the act of remembering is not just hearing about it. The act of remembering fully means actually realizing, actually seeing, actually knowing in direct, immediate experience that I am one with that infinite, transcendent being. That is my reality, knowing that in direct experience. And so for us, how do we get from here, the state of forgetfulness, to a state of remembrance, to a state where we know who it is that we are? So Sri Krishna says that the means for getting from here to there is through sacrifice. That sacrifice is a universal principle. Sacrifice is the nature of the universe itself. And so he talks about different forms of sacrifice, meaning different forms of spiritual practice, through which we come back to the realization of our true nature. As Vedanta says, we've never completely forgotten who we are, and that's why we can never be satisfied with the little things of life. Yes, Vedanta doesn't say, as the Buddha said, that all is suffering. Sarvam dukkham. Everything is suffering. Now, he didn't mean that it was out and out misery. He didn't deny that there were little joys and sorrows, but he said that even what he meant by all is suffering was that even the greatest joys we have in this life is not enough. Once we've had them a few times, we realize, well, I'm still unsatisfied. And so Vedanta doesn't say that everything is miserable. It would agree with what the Buddha taught. But instead of approaching it that way by saying everything is miserable, that's not a very happy way to begin a philosophy. One of the great mysteries is why Buddhism became so immensely popular and spread over the world as it did. When it begins by saying that life is misery, life is suffering, there is no soul, that is, you don't exist, and God doesn't exist. Swami Vivekananda said it was because of the great character of the Buddha. It was that which carried Buddhism forward. It was the great, wonderful character of the person, the Buddha. And also, of course, it was the richness of Indian culture that spread with Buddhism. Wherever Buddhism went, it took the richness of Indian culture. Buddhism adapted itself to every culture it went into. The Buddhist missionaries were very wise in not trying to turn everybody into an Indian. They adapted whatever country they went into, but they also made accessible the richness of Indian culture, the grammar, the medicine, the arts, the music, everything. And so each country adapted it to their own needs, but it was also the great richness of Buddhism. So coming back to the point, Hinduism doesn't start by saying that everything is miserable, nor does it start by saying you don't exist and God doesn't exist. Realize that and then everything is finished. No, it starts by saying that God alone exists and you are God. You alone exist as God, and that the nature of existence is bliss itself. But we experience misery, and everything in this life is unsatisfying because we have forgotten that, because we're looking at small things. As the Chandogya Upanishad says, Nalpe Sukhamasti. In the small, in the finite, there is no happiness, meaning no lasting happiness. Bhumaiva Sukham. The infinite alone is bliss. Why is it that when we go to a forest and look out over a vast expanse, or go to a mountaintop and look over a vast expanse, we feel so peaceful? Why is it that we go to the shore of the ocean and look out over the ocean and feel such expansiveness and peace of mind? It's because it reminds us of that which we are. Suddenly our limitations seem to drop away, at least for a moment. And so, again, Vedanta says that we are that now, but we've forgotten it, and so we have to have spiritual practice. And so sacrifice is one way of looking. It's not the only way of looking at it, and not the only way Vedanta approaches it, but it's the way that Sri Krishna approaches the topic of spiritual practice here and now. So in the verse 24, Brahman is the ladle, or also Brahman is the offering, arpanam, the offering or the ladle, because the ladle also is called arpanam. Brahman is the act of Brahman is the act of offering the oblation in the fire, which is Brahman, by Brahman who is Brahman. Or let me, instead of trying to follow this translation, which is very clumsy, let me just say it as we usually say it. The Brahman is the offering, Brahman is the ghee, havi, the ghee which is offered. Brahman is the fire into which you offer. Brahman is the one who offers into the fire that is Brahman. That one alone attains to Brahman, who sees Brahman in the midst of every action. That is, who sees that all of this are just waves rising in the ocean of Brahman. Who sees Brahman as the still, unmoving, unchanging background in which all of this universe of change is taking place. So one who sees Brahman in the midst of every action alone attains to Brahman. So why do we say this verse at mealtime, before eating? Because the digestive fire is the fire into which we're making a sacrifice. We're sacrificing the food, so the oblation, the food is Brahman. The act of offering it is Brahman. It's offered into the fire by Brahman himself, and so one who sees Brahman in the midst of that action of eating attains to Brahman. So it's transforming eating into a fire sacrifice, offering the oblation into the digestive fire. So verse 25, Sri Krishna says, Daivameva pare yajñam yoginah paryupasate brahmagnava pare yajñam yajñe naivopajuhvati. So here Daivam, belonging to the gods, or godly, or pertaining to the gods, apare yajñam. Others who are yogis, yogina, apare yogina, others who are yogis, always perform a yajna to the gods. That is, they perform a spiritual yajna. They perform a sacrifice to the gods. Brahmagnava pare yajñam yajñenaiva upajuhvati. So here, this is a rather obscure use of words in the second half of the verse. In most of the Gita, everything is extremely straightforward and clear. But here, Sri Krishna uses, at least according to all of the ancient commentators, and so not knowing any better interpretation, we have to depend on them. Here, the meaning of it is others offer sacrifice by sacrifice into the fire which is Brahman. But they say that according to Yaska, the great lexicographer, the Sanskrit lexicographer, who gave the lists of synonyms of words in Sanskrit, the yajna is one of the words that can be used to say Atman, the self. The self. So here, all of the commentators have said, all of the ones that I have read, and that's a good few, say that yajna here means the self. And so the second half of the verse means that there are others who offer the self by the self itself into the fire of Brahman, into the fire of Brahman. So they offer the self into the self. So the first half of the verse is that there are yogis who offer oblations to the gods as a spiritual sacrifice. That is, not for the attainment of worldly goods, because you can perform sacrifices, and most of the Vedic sacrifices were for the attainment of abhyudaya, that is, for the attainment of worldly good, for a long life, a healthy life, to have children, to get property, to be successful, to attain to a heavenly life of enjoyment, and so forth. And so that was often the motivation for performing sacrifice. But the higher motivation had nothing to do with heavenly life of enjoyment or attaining the good things of this life, but simply for the attainment of truth, for knowing the truth. And so the first verse, my interpretation would be that some have interpreted it differently. They say that it just means offering to the gods for worldly success. But he says yogina. And so Sri Krishna, the yogis, are not to those who were after worldly success. So the yogis perform spiritual sacrifice to the gods. That is, as an oblation to the gods for their spiritual awakening. And there are others who know more, who offer the self into Brahman by they themselves offer themselves into the fire of Brahman. So Brahman is seen as the fire, that is the receptacle of the offering. So sometimes I say the verse, I haven't used it for a while, a beautiful verse from the Vedas, which I'll chant it and then give the translation. That is, Ardram jvalati jyotirhamasmi jyotir jvalati brahmahamasmi yohamasmi brahmahamasmi ahamasmi brahmahamasmi ahamevaham mam juhomi swaha. So that means melting into the light. I am the light that shines, meaning the one who is chanting is realizing or knows his divine nature. And so melting into the light, that is, the identity is melting into the divine light, melting into the light. I am the light that shines. The light shines, the light which is Brahman. That which I am is nothing but Brahman. I exist, and I exist as Brahman. I myself offer myself into the infinite light which is myself. So that's the idea here, that there are others who offer themselves by themselves into the infinite light which is Brahman. That is, they offer the little self, which is in reality the big self, the infinite self, the self without limits. It's just because we have identified with littleness that we think that we are little and limited. And so they offer that little self into the infinite self. And become the infinite light. So here there are those two different sacrifices, one considered lower, the other higher. That is the lower, which is still good, offering to the deities for one's spiritual welfare. And the other making the offering of oneself into the infinite light for the attainment of the infinite knowledge. And that is with everything, and we have to always remember in Vedanta, especially in the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition, that can be approached both from the standpoint of knowledge and from the standpoint of devotion, of love. From the standpoint of knowledge, it's as I said, you offer knowingly the self into the infinite self, and you seek to know yourself as the infinite. From a devotional standpoint, you offer yourself into the ocean of God, the ocean of love. That is, it's a sacrifice of love. You sacrifice the little self into the infinite self, who is the divine being, the object of love. So, and then in verse 26, Sri Krishna says, Shrotradin indriyanyanye samyamagnishu juhvati shabdadin vishayananya indriyagnishu juhvati. So here there are two different sacrifices. One is Shrotradin indriyani anye samyamagnishu juhvati. So there are others, anye, who, juhvati, who sacrifice, who offer, Shrotradin indriyani, all of the sense organs, the ears and other sense organs, or the power of hearing, power of seeing, smelling, tasting, as well as the organs of action, the hands, the feet, etc. So there are others who offer the sense organs and the organs of actions into the fire of samyama. Samyama is a technical term that comes from yoga, Patanjala yoga, the yoga of Patanjali. There Patanjali defines samyama as a process of going from the dharana, dhyana, samadhi. So you dharana, dhyana, samadhi. First you focus the mind on the object, and then your concentration goes deeper. It becomes true meditation, and you keep it there until that changes into samadhi, and then there's one-pointed absorption into the object. And Patanjali says that wherever you perform samyama, whatever you perform samyama on, that object of your concentration gives up all of its secrets. That is the secret of higher knowledge. Wherever you can concentrate the mind, there, if you can concentrate it to the ultimate point of absorption into the object of concentration, the object gives up its secrets. So he says that if you make samyama on the movements of the stars, then you understand the heavens. If you make samyama on if you make samyama on the sun, then you understand the solar world. If you make samyama on different objects, you understand them. If you make samyama on a word, then you understand the distinction between the sound of the word, the meaning of the word, and the wave in the mind, which corresponds to the word and meaning. So here the first others offer the sense organs, the ear, etc., into the fires of samyama. That is, you offer your sense organs into the fires of samyama means that samyama, that process of concentration, instead of the mind going out through all of the sense organs and looking at this and looking at that and touching this and listening to that and smelling this and tasting that, etc., at the time of concentration, you focus the mind and you offer all of the sense organs into concentration, and the mind goes to its object and attains to samadhi, ultimate concentration. So here, of course, is for a very advanced yogin who is able to focus all of the sense organs into the mind, and then the mind into the object, and then one attains to samadhi. And the next half of the verse, the second half of the verse, is about one who has attained to that, but then comes back and sees the universe once again. Shabdadin vishayananya indriyagnishu juhvati. So here, anye, others, juhvati, they offer Shabdadin vishayan, the sense objects, sound and other sense objects, indriyagnishu, into the fires of the sense organs. That is, the sense organs themselves, the ears, the eyes, the nose, the tongue. Those are these fires. So a person who has attained to samadhi and then comes back from samadhi, then when they see the universe of diversity again, then they offer the objects of their senses, all that they perceive, into the fires of the senses, knowing that which is the truth, the truth of reality. And that can be seen also from a relative standpoint, from a standpoint of that's approachable by us, where we haven't attained to that type of concentration yet. One of my teachers told me decades ago, he said that when the mind becomes concentrated, and he wasn't talking about the ultimate concentration, but when it becomes relatively concentrated, when the mind is able to concentrate relatively easy, then one finds that all of the information that's coming in through the senses is coming in as if into the fire of the mind. The mind becomes like a fire, and all of the information that comes in through the senses and through the mind, through people's words and so forth, all of that goes into the fire of the mind and is processed, so that everything that comes to us becomes purified in the fire of the mind. So that also is a way of understanding the second half of the verse, that for one who has gained some power of concentration, then the mind becomes like a fire. Swami Yatishvarananda said that ordinary people, if they could see into the mind of a high spiritual aspirant, not a realized soul, but a high spiritual aspirant, they would be terrified, because they would see the tremendous activity, the tremendous intensity of the mind of such a soul. And so such a one, as this Swami told me at that time, he was known for being very, very austere. But at this point in his life, you'd see him reading newspapers and things like that. And so people wondered, what happened to this austere Swami who never used to do anything like that? Nowadays, he's reading newspapers and following the news and all of that. He told me that people don't understand that when the mind becomes focused to a certain degree, then even things like the news, it comes into the mind, and the mind processes it and turns it into knowledge, turns it into understanding. It says, oh, this is this means this means this means this means this. So the fire of the mind is, the analytical power of the mind is a flame and burning. So here he says, others offer the sense organs, the ear, etc., in the fires of samyama, that is, into concentration. Others offer the objects, that is, sound, etc., in the fires of the sense organs. So then in verse 27, he says, Sarvanindriya karmani prana karmani chapare atma samyama yogagnau juhvati jnana deepite. So here, apare, others, and others, cha, apare, and others, sarvanindriya karmani, prana karmani cha, others, juhvati, others offer all the action of all of the sense organs, sarvanindriya karmani, the actions of all sense organs, prana karmani cha, and the actions of the prana, that is the vital force which is animating the body and animating the mind as well. It's the flow of vital force within us which distinguishes the living from the dead, which distinguishes life from death. It's that vital energy which is the sign of life. And that's something that science has not yet discovered, that vital energy, but it can be discovered even by science. It's not something which is beyond scientific discovery. The Atman may be beyond scientific discovery because it's beyond all the sense organs. But the prana is something which is phenomenal. And as Swami Vivekananda said, it's like electricity, or it's a form of subtle electricity. But that which animates the physical body. Which is experiential, not a theory, but experiential. So there are others who offer the actions of all of their sense organs and the actions of their pranas, their vital force, which are 5 in number, but we won't go into that. Atma Samyama Yogagno, into the fire, the Agni, of the concentrated, the yoga of concentration on the self. Which is jnana dipite, which is fired with knowledge, which is lighted by knowledge, or the translation goes here. Others offer all of the activities of the organs, the sense organs, and the activities of the vital forces into the fire of the yoga, which takes the form of samyama on the self, that is focusing on the self, which has been lighted by knowledge. So lighted by knowledge means, in Vedanta, as in Buddhism, great emphasis is given to knowledge, not meaning book knowledge, but meaning awareness, knowledge of what is true. And so lighted by knowledge here means lighted by the knowledge of my identity with the divine. It's said in Vedanta that until one has to receive that knowledge, just good works are not enough. Good works are good, and good works will lead to the purification of the heart so that realization comes much more easily. Just devotion is not enough. Intense love is enough, but just ordinary devotion is not enough. And concentration of mind is not enough. Why was it that the school of Patanjali and the school of Sankhya, the two philosophical schools of yoga and Sankhya, they never realized the identity between the individual and the infinite. They came only to the discovery that each person is infinite, but a different infinite. It's because they didn't take the knowledge of the Upanishads, which says, "Thou art that, Tattvamasi," you are that infinite reality. So even if you attain to perfect concentration of the mind becomes a perfect instrument for seeing the truth, but still knowledge has to come. And so Sri Krishna is saying here that this fire is fire of Atma Samyama Yoga, the yoga of concentration on the self, is lighted, inflamed by knowledge. That is the knowledge that I am one with God. I am one with the infinite reality. I'm one with God. And so then with that knowledge, then focusing then making samyama, that is complete concentration and absorption into the self, then one becomes the self. So others offer all of the activities of the organs and the vital pranas. That is, instead of the mind running through the organs and then the pranas running at random through the body and mind, they withdraw the mind from the organs, which is offering the organs into the self. They withdraw the mind from the organs and from the prana and offer all of that into the self through samyama, through focusing on the self. So these, of course, in these 3 verses, it's a very high process that Sri Krishna is talking about. And then in verse 28, he says, Dravya yajñas tapo yajña yoga yajñas tatha pare swadhyaya jnana yajñascha yataya samshita brataha. So here he says the dravya yajna, that is the sacrifice of physical things. And dravya can also mean wealth. So the sacrifice of wealth, or the sacrifice of physical ingredients, like offering ghee into a fire, offering other things into a fire, etc. Or like in the Rajasuya sacrifice and other sacrifices where you offer the king would offer all of his wealth into the fire. So the material sacrifice, tapo yajna, the sacrifice of austerity. That is, of austerity in Vedanta means the control of the mind and the senses. It doesn't mean torturing. It doesn't mean mortification of the flesh. but it means the concentration of the mind and the senses. Yoga yajna, the sacrifice of yoga. That is, yoga is a sacrifice because yoga requires self-control, dedication to practice. So the sacrifice of yoga. Tathapare. So there are others who, there's some who practice dravya yajna, that is the sacrifice of wealth. Others who who perform the sacrifice of austerity. Others still who perform the sacrifice of yoga. Swadhyaya jnana yajnascha. And there are still others who perform the sacrifice of swadhyaya jnana. Now that some like Madhusudana have taken swadhyaya and jnana as two different sacrifices. The sacrifice of swadhyaya, that is of study, and the sacrifice of jnana, the sacrifice of knowledge. So taking that, it doesn't much matter. It could also mean the sacrifice of of study which leads to knowledge, or the study of knowledge. But taking it as, it doesn't much matter, but taking it as Madhusudana takes it here, as two different things. There's some who practice the swadhyaya of study, and here it means the study of sacred texts, that is, focusing the mind on the text, trying to understand, meditating on the text. Like Swami Turiyananda used to say, that he would take one verse from the Upanishad and meditate on it for a week or sometimes a month, just on one verse. So that kind of study, that which in the Christian spiritual tradition was known as Lectio Divina. Sometimes Lectio Divina meant the Mass, but other times it meant the sacred scriptural study, studying the scripture meditatively, not just reading it for information, but the meditative study of it. So, and then yataya samchita vrataha. Then there are others who are yatis, that is self-controlled ones, renunciates, monks, who are those who follow samchita vrataha, who have severe vows of sacrifice. So reading the translation here. Similarly, others are performers of sacrifice through wealth, or material sacrifice, through austerity, through yoga, through study, and through knowledge. Others are diligent ones with severe vows. So there are these different types of sacrifice. As some of you know, the Holy Mother, Sarada Devi, she used to say, those who have jarate dano, jarne jopo. Those who have wealth, they should give. And those who don't have anything should perform japa. So that idea again of sacrifice, that if you are blessed with wealth, then you should give for the welfare of others. You should give for good causes. That's the purpose of having wealth. The Swami Vivekananda said, the accumulation is only for later distribution. The one who accumulates and keeps for themselves, that stagnates and leads to death. And so whatever we accumulate, that is meant for distribution. Doesn't mean in a foolish way and just throwing bills out the window, but it means that it should be used for good causes and for distribution, for helping others, not just for oneself and not even just for one's family. It's good a householder has a responsibility to take care of their family and see that their children are provided for. But beyond that, it should not end with the family. It should go beyond the family. Otherwise, as Holy Mother and others said, that what a difference is there between us and animals. Animals also provide for their children, at least mammals do. So what's the difference between us and animals if that's all that we do? Just self-protecting in the little family unit. The family is good. The family should be taken care of. The family should be raised properly, should be loved. But we shouldn't limit ourselves to that. And so If we can give, should give to good causes and to the poor and to the needy, etc. And as Holy Mother said, if you don't have, then do japa, repeat the name of God. That also is a wonderful sacrifice. So, of course, she did not mean that if you have, only give things away and don't do japa. No, it wasn't a prohibition of japa for those who have money, but it was that those who have, they should give, and those who don't have, they can then they can do japa. That is their sacrifice. And so those who sacrifice through wealth, those who sacrifice through austerity, that is through acts of self-control, through yoga, that is through focusing the mind, through study, and through knowledge, or those who observe it with severe vows. So then in verse 29, he says, here I'll do the way that Madhusudana has arranged the verses. He does 29 and the first half of 30 together. And so we'll do it that way. It doesn't have to be done that way, and most commentators don't, but Madhusudana does, so I'll do that. So I'll read 29 and the first half of 30. Apane juhvati pranam prane panam tatha pare pranapana gati rudhva pranayama parayanah apare niyataharah pranan praneshu juhvati. So here he does all of these because together, because the next half of the verse 30, it talks about everything that has been said before regarding sacrifice. So here, apane juhvati pranam prane panam tathapare. I'm going to translate this different, or interpret it differently from the way Madhusudana does, because it's something I think there is a better. I don't think his interpretation makes as much sense. He says that there are some who offer the prana, the five pranas, the five vital forces. There's actually just one vital force, but it manifests in five different functions within the body. And so the two main pranas that we deal with, especially in control of the prana through breath control, are the prana and apana. So he says there's some who offer the apana into the prana and some who offer the prana into the apana, meaning that there's some who breathe in and offer the in-breath into the out-breath, and others who offer the out-breath into the in-breath. But that doesn't really make much sense, because pranayama means you're doing both. And so a more straightforward and useful meaning to me is that there are those who offer the prana into the apana and the apana into the prana, and who, having controlled the motion of the prana and the apana, they offer the sacrifice of pranayama, because pranayama includes this whole process in the two halves of the verse. So in pranayama, you breathe in, you hold the breath, you breathe out, you breathe back in, you hold the breath, you breathe out. And so it's puraka, kumbhaka, rechaka. Breathing in, holding, and breathing out, and then reversing the process. So that's pranayama. It's not that some people offer the in-breath into the out-breath, and others offer the out-breath into the in-breath. No, that you don't get very far that way. It's by doing the cycle that one performs a full pranayama. And so here he's talking about the sacrifice of pranayama. Swami Vivekananda says that just through the control of the prana, one can attain to samadhi. And I've heard people complain that, well, that's like cheating. Just controlling the breath, if you can attain prana, that's cheating. You not going through the trouble of other spiritual practices. But no, they've never tried pranayama. They've never done it as a spiritual practice. To be able to do pranayama successfully, it takes an extremely rigorous is practice an extremely self-controlled life. It's a very difficult practice. It's not cheating at all. It's not at all easy to do pranayama in such a way that the pranas become perfectly controlled. So here, those for whom their main practice is pranayama, the control of the breath, leading towards the control of the vital force itself, which leads to the control of the mind, perfect control of the mind. That's a very rigorous practice. And people can practice a little pranayama a few times a day and get a little bit of calmness of mind for a little while, and it'll help with the meditation and everything. That's good. But that doesn't lead to perfect control of the mind. It just helps. It's a help. But those who do pranayama as their main practice, that's a severe discipline, a very difficult discipline, which they do for hours a day. And everything they do during the day is by watching the effect on the breath. Everything that they do, they watch the effect on the breath, and they act only in such a way as to foster the control of the breath, the control of the, and the prana which is behind the breath. So he says, some offer the prana into the apana, still others the apana into the prana. Others who remain engaged in pranayama by stopping the movement of prana and apana, and who are well regulated in their food, offer the organs into the vital forces. But no, that to me, that doesn't make much sense. That he's talking about, and there's nothing in the verse which would argue that this is the correct interpretation. But he's talking about pranayama itself, offering the prana into the apana into the prana, and then both into the control of the prana and apana, which is attained in kumbhaka, that is, in holding the breath. So that is pranayama. And then in verse 30, Sri Krishna says, the second half of verse 30. Oh, he takes the second half of verse 30 and the first half of verse 31. So we'll do that. And then after 31, he comes back to normal verses. So, sarve pyete yajna vido yajna kshapita kalmashaha yajna shishtamrita bhujo yanti brahma sanatanam. So, sarve ete api, all of these indeed, yajna vido, are knowers of yajna. So all of these different types of sacrifices, from the dravya yajna, the sacrifice of material wealth, the sacrifice of study, the sacrifice of knowledge, the sacrifice of control of the food, all of these different sacrifices, the performers of these different types of sacrifice, all of these are knowers of sacrifice. They're all observers of sacrifice. Yajna kshapita kalmashaha. And through yajna, they have become purified of all evil. They become purified of all evil purified of the stain of evil through the performance of sacrifice. So such is the power of sacrifice that it purifies the mind. There's the idea in all religious traditions of expiation for the wrong things that we've done in the past and so forth. In Hinduism, they speak of prayaschitta, that which you do if you've done something seriously wrong, then you do something in order to counteract the effects of it. That is, you do some purificatory process. In Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox Christianity, they have confession where they confess their sins, and then the priest tells them that you should go and do this in order to expiate your sins. And so the idea that we, because of our limited minds, our limited understanding, our ignorance, our selfishness, based on that ignorance and so forth, we do things that we shouldn't do. And so every religion has some way of purifying the mind and the heart, so so that that sense of guilt, that sense of the sense of guilt that comes from doing things wrong, that can be washed away. And so here Sri Krishna is saying that those who perform any kind of sacrifice, anything that's done, any sacrifice performed sincerely, that washes away the sin from the evil from our bad actions. And then the first half of verse 31, which he takes here together, says, Yajñashishtamrita bhujo yanti brahma sanatanam. Yajñashishtamrita bhujo, those who partake of the nectar of the remains of sacrifice. So the easy way to understand this in terms that you're all familiar with is the prasad, which we take after a puja. After a worship, you take the blessed food. It's considered that the blessed food which has been offered in a ritual worship, offered properly, that it is a great purification and a great help to the purification of the mind. And so the idea is that the results of any sacrifice, any kind of sacrifice, there are results from the sacrifice. And so those who eat, as it were, the results, the nectarine results of the sacrifice, yanti brahma sanatanam, they attain to the eternal Brahman. They go to the eternal Brahman. So one who performs a sacrifice and lives for sacrifice and partakes of the results of the sacrifice, not the worldly results, not the fruits of good fruits of the worldly fruits, but the spiritual fruits of the sacrifice, they attain to Brahman. So here he says, the translation goes, those who know the sacrifices, who have their sins destroyed by the sacrifices, and who partake of the nectar during the period left after the performance of the sacrifices, all of them reach the eternal Brahman. Again, this I would interpret a little differently, as I just did. Before this, I read the translation, but both work. And then the end of verse 31 is, Nayam loko yajñasya kutonya kurusattama. So, O Kurusattama, O best of the Kurus, O best of the Kurus, that is, O Arjuna, who was of the Kuru lineage. Nayam loka asti yajñasya kuto anya loka. So this world is not for those who do not perform sacrifice, what to speak of the afterlife. This world itself is not for those who don't perform sacrifice, what to speak of the afterlife. That can be taken with a deep spiritual meaning, and it can be taken with a useful ordinary meaning also. That is that all of us have the need to feel useful. A person who feels useless is a miserable person. They feel cut off from life, cut off from the universe. Everyone has the need to feel useful. That's one of the great problems for older people when they get to the point where they can't do much. They feel useful. They feel, I'm just a burden on everybody. Everyone has to take care of me. I can't do anything. So that we have to assure older people that their very being is useful to us. They don't have to do anything. They've done enough. Just being with us is enough. Because everyone has a need to feel useful. That is, useful meaning what? If we're not useful, it means we're not participating in this grand sacrifice which the universe is. The universe is a sacrifice. We can only breathe in if we first breathed out. If we don't give up the air we've taken in, we can't take more air in. Everything is a sacrifice in this life. Life feeds on life. One form of life becomes the food for another form of life. And even those at the top of the food chain, like human beings, or in the animal kingdom, which includes human beings, but cutting out human beings, those like tigers and lions and so forth, that are at the top of the food chain, and the among other animals, then they also become they're eventually going to die, at least from disease, and they become food for low forms of life. So you find the whales living on and other things living on plankton, a very primitive form of life in the ocean. Plankton is the basic food that feeds the oceans. And it goes up to the whales, and then the whales themselves die and become food for bacteria and so forth, which eventually feeds the food chain again. So all of us we're taking in food, and we ourselves will become food at some point. So this world ceases to exist for one who does not perform sacrifices. How can there be the other world, O best among the Kurus? Or as I would say, and this I think is just a problem of translation, not of Madhusudana's interpretation, but this world exists only for those, this world does not exist for those who don't perform sacrifice. What to speak of the other world? How could that exist for those who don't perform sacrifice? So, sacrifice again means that you receive and that you give. You receive and you give. If you don't give back something, then and only try to receive, then you first of all become extremely miserable. You become extremely limited. You become extremely selfish. You become encased in littleness. You become cut off from life, and then you suffer. So again, all of this was on the topic of yajna, and how yajna is the root of life itself. So we'll stop here and continue with 32 next time. So let me see if there are any questions. Yes, Jayanta. Oh, do you have a microphone? Let's get that so that it gets so it's others can hear, and also the recording, since it's being live streamed. Jayanta, here, over here. No, hold on a second. It's not on. He has to flip a switch there. Now try.
Okay.
Yeah.
Question is about the pranayam. You said, see, mind is a subtle, like it is not like gross that way, but all the breathing and all these things are like more or less physical object, or whatever you are breathing is in the gross level. How a gross level can control the subtlety of the
Yes. So how can the gross level, which is the breathing, that's something that's quite physical, quite measurable, and visible, tangible. How can that control something which is tangible, less tangible, that is something which is very subtle, like the prana, which is vital force, and like the mind, which is even more subtle. The prana, the vital force, is that which mediates between the body and the mind. So we control the prana, the breath, in order to control the prana. There's a great misunderstanding in many texts, that is translated texts on yoga and so forth, where they speak of the breath as if that were prana. No, prana doesn't mean breath. Prana means the vital force which controls the breathing process. And so we have within us, we have the nervous activities which we have control over, like the movement of my hand, swallowing and so forth, and other processes which we don't have control over, like digestion and so forth. That happens, or it happens well or happens ill, whether I want it to or not. It's not under my control. I can't say, well, I'm going to stop my digestion now. The same with the heartbeat. But the breath is a point where we can breathe automatically without thinking about it, or we can control it. And so it's a point where we can control the whole nervous system, both the conscious and the consciously controlled and the unconscious, so autonomous, autonomous nervous system. I forgot my old terms from physiology, but we can control the whole of the nervous system. So we control the breath, not because we want to control the breath itself, but because we want to control the vital force which is behind the breath. And so it's catching hold of something which is tangible to get to something which is intangible. Because when we hold our breath, what do we want more than anything? We want to breathe. And yet I say, no, I'm practicing breath control, so I'm going to hold for a certain number of counts. Of course, you can't do this too long for obvious reasons, but you do it for a certain number of counts. The body wants to breathe on its own. It just wants to go, but you say, no, I'm going to do it in a controlled way. I'm breathing in on a count of 4, I'm holding for a count of 16, I'm breathing out for a count of 8. The body says, no, let me just breathe, let me breathe. No, we're going to do it this way. And so it's the prana which is pushing the body to breathe in its normal way. And I am saying no. So I'm exerting willpower to control this physical process, but thereby I'm controlling the prana which is trying to push me to breathe. And so I get control of the prana, and the prana is that which mediates between the mind and body. Why is my mind always running all over the place? It's because of the random movement of prana within the body. The prana is flowing through the body, but in a random, chaotic way, and stimulating the mind so that it goes all over the place. But through pranayama, I bring rhythm to the breath, and that brings rhythm to the prana, control to the prana, and that brings rhythm to the mind, and then the mind becomes calm, and then the mind becomes focused. And so I get control through the breath of something more subtle, which is the prana, and through the prana I get to control of something even more subtle, which is the mind. And then when the mind is under control, then I can focus the mind on the truth. So that's it. Any other question?
Then I can ask one more.
Yes, one more.
The Buddhist philosophy that you say nihilism, is it not same as the Sunnabad, what we have in our Vedantic tradition?
Well, there are a number of different forms of Buddhism, and so the Mahayana Buddhism accepts Shunyavada, that is the belief in emptiness, that reality is empty of all anything that could be said of it. That can be harmonized with the Vedanta view. Vedanta tends to speak of ultimate reality in positive terms, full, infinite, reality itself, luminous, etc. Buddhists speak of it in negative terms. It's a very rare Buddhist who will agree that we are speaking of the same thing they're speaking of. To a Vedantist, it's obvious that we are. But to a Buddhist, they put great emphasis on words and the meaning of words. And so I've had many discussions with Buddhist friends, scholarly Buddhist friends, well-trained Buddhist friends, trying to explain to them that what we mean by Atman is not what they think we mean. The Buddha said there is no Atman, but the Buddha said there is no Pudgalatman, which means the individual self, the individual phenomenal self, that's just an illusion. And so when I talk with Buddhist friends and say that, well, by the Atman, we don't mean that. We agree that the phenomenal self disappears where we realize our true transcendental self. And then even the phenomenal self is seen as a manifestation of that reality. But the reality is the infinite self. And that is transcendental, is beyond time, space. There's nothing that can be said of it because it's beyond conceptualization. And then the Buddha says, yes, but we don't believe in the self. Yes, but what we mean by self is what you're talking about. And I again explained it and said, yeah, but we don't believe in the self. So it'll be very difficult to convince a Buddhist that we're speaking of the same thing, but to a Vedantist. And that the reason why it's difficult to convince a Buddhist is Buddhism was a path which developed as a reaction to Hinduism. And so it was, we're not like them. We're not like that. And so that continues in the Buddhist tradition of distinguishing themselves from the Vedic tradition. So Swami Vivekananda said that's the great danger in any reform movement. If you define yourself by what you're not, then you've limited yourself. So, okay, so we'll stop here. So let me give a closing chant and then I'll give announcements. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. That infinite reality is full, perfect, and complete. This relative universe is full, perfect, and complete. From out of the fullness of that infinite reality, the fullness of this universe has come. And yet that reality remains ever the same. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us and to all the beings of the universe. So for announcements, on Thursday we'll have